Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Teaching Nonviolent Atonement live chat. It's Halloween. Suzanne, happy Halloween.
Same to you.
I see you wore your orange today.
That's the best I could do.
That was good planning.
I'm a pumpkin.
Yeah, it's good look for you. I mean, it's awesome. It's good. Kevin Miller is with us. Hi, Kevin. How are you today?
I'm doing great.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being with us. It's especially awesome that you're here on Halloween to talk about good and evil, and especially your documentary, Hellbound.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. Halloween's one of my favorite times of year.
Awesome. Good. We are starting off the chat in discussion mode, which means that you and we are the only ones who are able to talk at the moment. But we have other people online, and they will be able to virtually raise their hand if they have a comment or a question. And when they do that, we will bring them in. So that's kind of how it's going to run today. But before we start talking, I would like to give a brief summary of what we have coming up. So next week, November 7th, we will talk with Mark Anspach, who translated and wrote a great introduction for René Girard's latest book, Anorexia and Mimetic Desire. Mark also translated and wrote an introduction to René's book, Oedipus Unbound, Selected Writings on Rivalry and Desire. And if anybody's interested in doing a little homework, you can find on Teaching Nonviolent Atonement website article that Mark wrote on anorexia with a recent tragic event of a model.
Yeah, actually it was about 5-6 years ago.
5 or 6 years ago.
But, yeah. Who died of anorexia.
Yeah. So this is a tough issue for a lot of people, and to talk about it, to bring what mimetic desire can bring to the table into it, I think is an important thing, both for the intellectual aspect of it, and also for bringing in an empathic response towards because we all know someone or have experienced this disease, and it's very emotional and tough. So we're looking forward to that. November 14th, we're going to be talking with Paul Nectarline. Hi, Tony Ciccarello. There you are. Tony, I'm going to mute you, nothing personal. But when you want to come on into the chat and make a comment or a question, just virtually raise your hand up there in the My Mood, okay? I love you, Tony, and I hate to do this. Oh, wait, no, I got you. There you go.
You're
All
fine.
right.
We're
All right.
fine.
Okay.
Love you, Tony.
There we go. So on November 14th, we're going to be talking with our good friend Paul Nectarline about the upcoming Girardian lectionary text. And I did a little research this morning on it, and it's going to be awesome because it's one of the little apocalypses of Jesus.
Oh.
So it's the one in Luke where Jesus says you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines and all these kinds of things. And just simmer down. And we Girardians love that stuff because it places the violence on us and not on God. So I am excited to talk with Paul about that. Then on the 21st, we'll have an open chat to discuss all of our previous chats that we've had, going back to last week with David Dawson and his book on scapegoats. And we'll review Kevin's chat and Mark Anspach's chat and Paul's chat too. So that'll be a fun open chat, and I hope this is okay with you, Suzanne. We will not meet on Thanksgiving.
No.
Is that okay?
Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, that's the way it'll go.
I thought you were supposed to be with your family on Thanksgiving.
Well, this is right. Yeah. So that's a good point. Yeah. Okay. We'll think about it. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Kevin, thank you so much for being on the show again. I want to point out that we are particularly excited about next week here at Raven, where you will receive the Raven Award for Arts and Entertainment this year. It's always given to an artist whose work challenges the myth of redemptive violence and sacred violence. So Kevin, your documentary creatively demystifies sacred violence, and we're just excited to have you come to Chicago and give you this award.
Yeah, and your wife is coming too.
yeah, awesome. We get to meet Kevin's better half.
It's always nice to prove to the world that my wife exists.
Right. Yeah, you're always running home to be with her, Kevin. I don't get it.
Yeah. No, I'm very excited to receive it. I mean, it's a tremendous honor, and just even to be considered an artist is an honor. To be honest, because you make documentary films, I think a lot of people don't necessarily think of them as a form of artistry. We tend to think of it as journalism or something like that. But it's very. I feel very honored to receive it.
That's awesome. Well, we are honored to have you and excited about it. So, Kevin, you also blog at your website over on Pathos at Hellbound, Exploring Faith and Film, Good and Evil, where you employ mimetic theory quite frequently to understand these topics. And since we're a group focused on mimetic theory, I was wondering, if you could tell us a little bit about mimetic theory has helped you understand hell and good and evil.
Well, I think that, really the key revelation for me in the making of Hellbound was really my immersion in mimetic theory, thanks in large part to Michael Hardin. It just for me has become such a useful lens in terms of, really looking at not only religion, Christianity in specific, but just life in general. And so when it comes to something like hell, that was really my suspicion going in to interview Michael, is that somehow this idea of a separation of humanity, into the righteous and the wicked, it seemed like this ultimate form of scapegoating, this wish fulfillment, and so that what is God is the ultimate scapegoater, and so that for the righteous to have bliss in heaven, somebody's got to pay, in a sense, and somebody's always got to pay, it seems, within that scapegoating paradigm. And so the idea that Christ is the one that liberates us from that Christ, in a sense, pays, so he becomes the victim to end all victims, to me is like, it's one of the most liberating things, because it really helps me be able to talk to people about the Christian narrative in a way that it becomes immediately relevant, in a way that doesn't require people, at least initially, maybe to even believe anything supernatural, but just to understand sort of this mechanism that humanity works under, and how the narrative of Christ is just really the undoing of that mechanism. So for me, that's really exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to create this film?
Yeah, well, Hellbound for me was very much, I think it began the way I think anything should from a creative point of view, is that the only thing I really set out to satisfy was my own curiosity. And I think what, it really begins with me having a second look at the atonement via, a friend of mine, Brad Jersak, who was in the film and was really taking a second look at this type of thing, and the connection between God and violence. And me beginning to consider the idea of, could it be possible that all people might be reconciled to God in the end? I mean, is that even a tenable view within, Orthodox Christianity? And really setting out to see if a case could be made for that. And so it begins as me just really on a personal journey, but with the publication of Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, early on in our development process, it really suddenly opened things up for me to realize how political and just how much is riding on this question. So for me, the making of the film becomes, it ends up, I think, being not so much about what happens to us after we die, but what kind of a world are we creating based on the theology that we hold. I think that to me, became the more important question.
Yeah, right in the beginning, you start with images from 9/11, and as I was rewatching the documentary, you had clips of newscasters talking about the 10-year anniversary, and Brian Williams says that this is the day that hell rained down in New York. And so, just hearing you say it's much more about what we do here now on Earth, and hearing that with Brian Williams talking about hell raining down on New York on 9/11, makes me think that this has real practical implications for how we live our lives here on Earth.
Well, I've received a little bit of flack. People think some people thought I was exploiting 9/11 imagery and that sort of thing in the film, but I don't think so. Like, really, what I was trying to do was to root the discussion of hell in a real world situation that we can all identify with, because it just seems like a profound injustice. Not just what happened in New York and the Pentagon and the other places that were hit, but also the response to 9/11. A decade of war in two countries, and so these issues are front and center. So let's root this discussion of hell in a real world situation. And the other thing I would say too is, as Brian Williams does, is that hell becomes this really handy narrative when we're trying to express the gravity of how we feel about a certain event. So hell on earth, and so there's an intuitive sense of that the scales of justice were just really put out of balance, and so something needs to happen to bring them back into balance. And unfortunately, I think that it tends to go the other way, is that when the scales of justice go like this, we push them way far in the opposite direction. And again, it gets back to this notion that somebody's always got to pay, and that just seems right in a very kind of human form of logic.
Yeah, it's the mimetic theory principle that violence always escalates, and revenge is not just about eye for an eye, it's eye for an eye and a little bit more. It's just always the way that it ends up working out, and who started it, who didn't start it is the question that always gets asked, but it's the irrelevant question, because you're just going to keep creating hell for everyone on Earth. And
that's the ironic thing that Walter Wink points out, is that especially when violence is successful, that's the most dangerous, because once violence is successful, well then, I got to get me one of those, because that works so well. And this is the irony, is that the stronger we react to violence and the more successful we are, then that just creates a new model for those that we oppose. And somebody who I think really just nails this is Christopher Nolan in his movie The Dark Knight. I just think it's a really profound film that just really gets at the heart of this.
Yeah, what is it about that film for you that does that?
Well, the Joker basically in the film represents this force of chaos. Or I think it's really a film about the war on terror, and so he's taunting Batman in a sense that your mere presence and every action you take, it just breeds a counter reaction. So you being here is the biggest threat to Gotham, because you're so successful at using violence. Well, that's just going to then trigger people who want to somehow overcome that. So there's an imitation at work there.
There's also that great interrogation scene where Batman just starts pounding on the Joker, and he just laughs at him, and he just seems to be growing stronger and stronger as he's getting pounded with this violence. It's a fascinating film, and loses itself to mimetic theory beautifully.
Yeah.
Kevin, you'd mentioned Brad Jersak, and a lot of people assume that Hellbound came about because of Rob Bell, but you really got the idea for Hellbound from Brad's film, Her Gates Will Never Be Shut. Is that right?
Book actually, yeah. I actually edited Brad's book. That was back in the fall of 2008, I got the idea for the film then, but I wasn't in a position really to act on it until January 2011. So I heard about Rob Bell's book. It was coincidental with us developing the film. I was actually just finalizing our initial poster artwork, and so we rushed out a press release actually as soon as I heard about the book, because we wanted to make sure that we staked out the territory, that nobody else would get the idea. So it was a really happy accident for us that Rob hit the zeitgeist when he did, because that positioned us well in terms of coming in behind with the film.
Nice. I want to get to, you've mentioned, I think, in your commentary on the DVD, that Kevin DeYoung makes this really great point, that what we're really dealing here with is different gods, or different views of gods. What do you think that's a helpful way to look at this discussion about hell?
I think it is. I mean, that Kevin DeYoung wrote, I think, one of the most, again, I don't agree with his theological position, but I think he really assessed the current situation well to say that he and Rob Bell essentially do worship different gods, and I would define the gods like this: the God, there's a sacrificial God, and there's a self-sacrificial God, and those gods are not the same and cannot be the same, because a God that demands sacrifice, a God that must have his wrath satisfied, is inherently a self-centered God. And a God that is willing to sacrifice God's self on behalf of others so that we might actually be liberated from our wrath is a very, very different God. And I believe that is the God that's represented in the person of Jesus Christ, who literally sacrifices himself on behalf of others. And so I think Kevin DeYoung nails it. But I would say that, I find that the God that he, advocates is incompatible with my view of Christ. Now, he would say the same thing about me, but I mean, I think that the divide is that stark. It's that much of a contrast, at least within, Protestant evangelicalism.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You'd mentioned a little bit earlier about how we don't want to. You alluded to we don't want to get rid of the language of hell, and Richard Beck really points this out in the extras in the DVD, which are all just so great. And he says that we don't want to get rid of the language of hell, but maybe understand it in a different way. What's he trying to get at there?
Well, I'm glad you keep mentioning the DVD, because there are a number of things on the DVD that are only available on the DVD for those of you who haven't purchased it. Well, Richard Beck, what he's trying to get at is if we don't have the language of hell, we just have psychology, sociology, politics, and those vocabularies aren't adequate to express the gravity of how we feel when we're confronted by evil. We almost lost our son, actually, about a month and a half ago. He came close to drowning in a river near here where I live. He got trapped under a little waterfall. And let me tell you, the depth of horror that we still feel whenever we drive past that place, which we have to drive by frequently, is terrible. So, I can't imagine losing a child to a violent death, like a school shooting or something like that. And it's not enough to just, that behavior is damnable in a sense. And I think what Beck is trying to get at is that we have to allow room to, feel the full weight of evil in the world. And that's, again, something we were trying to allude to at the beginning of Hellbound, is that we don't want to minimize, like, if somebody is a universalist, that doesn't mean that there's a minimalization of evil or suffering. But the question is, how do we deal with that, or how does God deal with that in the end? And is punishment an end in itself, or is punishment or consequences, are they a means to an end? And I think that's really what the debate is when it comes to hell, is that. And I think sometimes it's cast in a different way. Well, we either have eternal, irreversible consequences, or we have no consequences. Well, I mean, we have a legal system right now where, we have pretty serious consequences, but they're not, everlasting consequences, and yet we still feel we were able to achieve justice. So, I think that's one of the problems we face here is how do we frame this whole discussion?
Yeah, there's you interview some of the people at Westboro Baptist Church, and you've taken a little bit of heat for doing that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the last thing.
One of the things that they bring up is you ask them at one point, well, what's the purpose of hell? And they say, well, God can send anybody to hell because that's what God wants to do, and who are you to question God about that? While there are others who say, well, if there is a hell, it has to have a purpose, and God's purpose is to redeem. So there are these different views of hell, and I'm just wondering, what your experience was with that different views of hell being redemptive or not redemptive.
Yeah, well, the Westboro Baptists, I did take some flack for putting them in the film because, again, who wants to promote them any more than they're already promoting themselves? They are self-promoters, and they have a very hateful, spiteful message. But at the same time, for me, what they represent is really what happens when we become so fixed in a position. And so it's partly about what they believe, but more about how do they hold the belief, and just this very staunch, rigid way of holding beliefs. And yeah, so I encountered in the making of the film people across the spectrum. So some people who really believe that the most loving thing God can do is basically condemn the unrepentant to hell for all eternity. Other people will hold to a view of annihilation that and of course that comes in different flavors, and then different views of hell as being ultimately redemptive. I like the way that Robin Perry puts it in the film, where he basically says you can hold on to all of this language and all of this imagery that you want, but it's just not the end of the story. And so that, again, it's punishment as a means to an end. Because this is the way I look at it, is that punishment that's an end in itself, it comes at the expense of somebody. It comes at the expense, basically, of the one being punished. And it can only satisfy the one doing the punishing. And so I find it really hard to see how that could be compatible with a God who is loving, to basically take an action that's an ultimate eternal action, which is one that is essentially self-centered because it satisfies God, and it comes at the expense of the sinner, which to me feels like scapegoating, because there's got to be a victim for there to be peace. And that just smells a little fishy to me. It smells a little too human. It doesn't seem like revelation. It doesn't. It's that we can come up with that on our own. That's the way I always look at it. And if there is revelation in Scripture, you would think it would come into this closed loop of violence and try and introduce a new way of thinking.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the things you say in the film. If we just get rid of all of the evil guys, if we just kill all of the evil guys, will there be any of us left?
Yeah. Somebody's got to be around to turn out the lights. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a great way to look at it. I want to invite our friends in to ask questions and comments very soon. But before we do that, one of the biggest themes that runs throughout Hellbound is this idea of free will. And so there are people who are believers in free will, and there are others who kind of challenge the modern or basic understanding of free will, like Brad Jersak asks, how free is our will if we are born in certain contexts and social situations and things like that? So I was wondering, like, what you make of free will from this experience.
Well, there's a very good reason why I'm not a Muslim, and it has nothing to do with my free will. It has to do with, the situation that I was born into and that I was socialized into. And it is a very exceptional person to be born in Foam Lake, Saskatchewan, where I was born, who ends up, becoming somebody fighting for the Taliban in Afghanistan. So that is so exceptional, it almost would never ever happen. I prefer to think in terms Richard Beck uses, which is strong and weak volitional capacity, because then you're not in a either or situation. You're really on a continuum, and so I would definitely look toward the side of weak volitional capacity, that the individual, and again, I think this is an insight from mimetic theory, is that the individual is the choices that we make are so enmeshed with our environment that I think we have a very hard time locating the ultimate responsibility in the individual. I know we all want to do that, especially in the case of a violent crime. We all want to point the finger, but again, I would look at if you want to look at some of these people who've done mass shootings in the United States in the last little while, I think that you can always draw concentric circles around these people to say, they're all embedded in a situation that somehow allowed this to happen, and that those concentric circles keep moving out until they end up at our doorstep. And so I think that a lot of times this really heavy emphasis on personal autonomy and free will and that sort of thing is a way of absolving ourselves of responsibility for the other. So I really appreciate actually what Sam Harris, the atheist, has to say about this, which is, the more we begin to recognize our kind of co-responsibility for the choices that we make, the more compassionate we actually become, because we start to approach the other with a sense of responsibility as opposed to a sense of blame, because we recognize that there's a give and a take in terms of the choices that we're making.
That's great. I love it. If anybody has a comment or a question, we will bring you in to talk with Kevin. Tim Brown sent me some questions before the chat. Tim, I don't know if you can talk, but I'm going to unmute you. Try to unmute you anyway. I don't know if I can. But Tim said that he may or may not be able to come in and ask a question. So he sent me some questions, and I'm going to bring them up now while other people formulate questions and comments, and we'll bring you in. So Tim asks something of it is a mimetic question, and it's a good follow-up to what we were just talking about. What role does biography play in how people see the issue of hell?
What role does biography play?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think it's decisive in the sense that depending on what kind of a context that you're born into, and so you're receiving a worldview from your family, or if you're part of a faith community or something like that, and then of course there's also all sorts of experiential issues, depending on what you've experienced in life, if you've been victimized or what have you. So I think that you're going to be predisposed to one position or another. So I think it's a very important role, because I mean, really, we're the sum. Charlie Sheen, he said that I'm the sum of the here and now. But I think that we are oftentimes the sum of our past experiences. That they're always weighing on us in one way. We're either kind of being driven by them or reacting against them, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, and I was, in preparing for the show today, I was listening to Hellbound in my car, and had it hooked up to my car while my children were watching a DVD coming down from the top of our ceiling in the car, and I didn't know that my son in the far back wasn't watching the show that I thought he was watching. He was listening to Hellbound. And in the beginning, you've got the Westboro Baptist people who are like, God hates those people, God hates those people. And my son in the back says, God doesn't hate anyone. Aww. And like right then, I was like, how Deuteronomy says, teach your children, right?
Right.
I was like, oh my God, that's so important and so illustrative of how it's so important to form our children and one another in certain views of God, hopefully healthy, loving views of God. Because if you don't, then I guess this is all getting to how much theology, our views of God, our worldviews as a whole, I guess, impact what we do.
Yeah, well, I think so. And, I was just going to speak about that too. Miroslav Volf has a fantastic book called The End of Memory, where he looks at the role that memory plays in identity. And I think that's a very, very fascinating discussion, because not only do our memories really, form who we are, it gets into the question of how will our life be remembered, or how will God remember our lives, and I think that, will we be defined by the worst things that we do, or by the best things, or whatever. So I think that, it's a very important thing to consider.
Kevin, I wonder if I could raise the issue from the perspective of my sister, who's a Jehovah's Witness. And we talk a lot about the end times, when God is going to decide who's going to be with God for eternity and who's going to go to hell for eternity. And her perspective after, I could only listen to her on this subject for the long time, because I already love her and know she's a nice person. So most time when I hear people say, believing in hell, I think, boy, they must be nasty and mean somehow deep inside. But I know that's not true about my sister, and after listening to her for a long time, I finally realized that her concern, her belief in hell comes from her concern about suffering in the world, and that when she sees that people are victims of other people and who cause them suffering, she thinks that, first of all, that God will make their suffering whole, that God will alleviate their suffering at the end, but that there will be consequences for the people who cause that suffering. And without those consequences, there would be no motivation to repent, to reform yourself. And so her ideas about hell are born out of this deep empathy with people who are suffering. And I wonder if you encountered that, or how you digest all of that.
Yeah, well, I would agree that, I think that oftentimes our desire for hell is a result of empathy or compassion, and just this cry, to say this is wrong. And, if God doesn't make this right, God is evil, because, then God is just perpetuating that. And so I totally understand that. And, I came to faith through a group of people, Mennonite brethren folks, and who were very staunch believers in hell, but were some of the kindest. I mean, the thing that drew me to them was that they were the most kindest, loving people I knew. And so, yeah, I far be it for me to say that believing in eternal hell is a result of you being an angry, vicious person, or that it turns you into one. But at the same time, we have to look at history, and we have to say that collectively that this belief in hell has fueled some of the most atrocious behavior that we've ever witnessed. I mean, you go back to, really beginning with Augustine, saying that, and some of the reformers, following that, saying that people who are heretics are worse than murderers and should be treated as such, and because they're endangering people for eternity. So better a little fire now than fire forever. And so, and it also, I think, unconsciously leads to sort of almost a secularized version of this us and them thinking, where we start to use this belief in us being righteous to justify some of the worst violence imaginable. So I would say this is that I think that within our own justice system, we recognize a whole number of different purposes to justice. So, that obviously there's this idea of retribution. You do the crime, you do the time. We have a desire for public protection, which is why, certain people need to be removed from society. We want to deter certain behaviors. But on the other side, though, I think that the ultimate goals that we're trying to work toward in our justice system are rehabilitation, restitution, and the highest goal would be some kind of reconciliation between the offender and the victim, between the offender and society. And so that I think even in our own justice system, the highest good it can achieve is ultimately redemptive. That doesn't minimize the consequences of people's behavior. And so when a murderer and say parents of his or her victims are reconciled, that doesn't come through a minimization of what happened. It comes through the offender fully recognizing the extent of the evil that he or she has committed and repenting with tears, and that there's ultimately forgiveness. I mean, that is powerful. That is extremely rare, but it is powerful and it is achievable. And so I would just say in the ultimate good that can be achieved in the universe, I would hope, is that would become the ultimate end of all evil that happens in the world. Because I think even anyone who's victimized, that cry for justice, they want the offender to recognize what they've done. And right. And this is one of the problems I have with hell, is this big sequestering of everyone that's evil, is that how can we ever achieve healing if we're never able to confront the offender that's wronged us? We need that. And if these people are annihilated or, somehow removed, I mean, I just think, okay, is God just going to sort of magically fix people? Well, how can you really achieve psychological and emotional wholeness?
Right. And it's so, the way you describe the repentance is so beautiful, because it's almost as if the threat of punishment gets in the way of people being able to be honest with themselves and their victims. If
Right.
in other words, it makes you defensive. If I'm saying, Kevin, you really hurt me and I'm never going to talk to you again, blah, 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 right away you're going to say, wait a minute, you hurt me. There's not going to be a mutual ability to confess to one another. So there's a way, it's so paradoxical to me, because the threat of punishment is often seen as the path to good behavior, where the way you just described it, it might get in the way of people being fully honest with themselves about what they've done. Would you?
Well, I would give you a contemporary example. The government of Canada just took this unprecedented move a few years ago to apologize to Canada's Aboriginal people for the way they were treated, especially within the residential school system, which was managed in conjunction with certain churches in Canada. And for years, the fear of the legal situation that would put the government in if they actually come forward and acknowledge guilt prevents that reconciliation from happening. So I think that you're correct there, that fear of punishment, again, there's certain places and points in times where fear of punishment maybe does keep us on the straight and narrow, but I think in an ultimate sense, it means that our behavior is just being modified. Our hearts aren't being changed.
Wow. Tim has some more questions going off of this. Do you think that there might be some deep wound that is met by imagining others being tortured forever?
I think so in a sense, but I think even the person who is, really, really hurting from some kind of injustice. I mean, the way I put it is this: if you believe that God, in heaven all the tears will be wiped away and all that sort of thing, like if you hold to sort of this traditional view that in the end God will make all things right, I would sort of ask the question of, if whatever horrible thing happened to you, and you lost a family member or whatever, if in the end all these things are restored to you, now what do you want to see happen to the person who wronged you? And I think that we tend to view these types of questions through the lens of our pain and suffering, which blinds us to this idea that if you're a Christian, you're also supposed to hold is that God is all powerful and that God, in a sense, can unravel everything that's been twisted up. And so I would encourage people to have faith, a bigger view of God, to say that God isn't limited the way we are. And I think that's one of the problems, one of the reasons why we just want people to pay, is because that's the best we can do. There's certain things we just can't undo. So while the best we can do is at least make the bastard pay, so to speak. And that gives us a bit of satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
Tim follows up that with thanks for the insight. I'm trying to understand why folks need hell. Why do folks need hell? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that, Kevin?
Yeah, well, I think that in the same way that we all need justice, and hell seems like the way we're going to get it. And I just, like Robin Perry in the movie, I want to encourage people to think beyond simple retribution, that there's a way to have justice that doesn't come at the expense of the offender, because we're all offenders, and it doesn't come at the expense of the victim, because we're all victims. And that there can be a way of achieving that sense of justice without somebody paying for all eternity, except maybe God.
Right, because that kind of justice is wholeness, meaning no one's excluded from the caring community.
Right.
Which, back to what you were saying, that hell is just like, if God's doing this, God's scapegoating. So God's excluding some people and telling us to love our enemies, which is kind of a little bit of a double bind, situation.
Yeah. But to be included into the community, there's a process and a path, right? That you can't just say, oh yeah, okay, fine, you're back in. No, I mean, we have to deal with what's happened here. And, that's the way our families hopefully operate. That's the way, we operate in community here. And so that's, again, I know somebody like Kevin DeYoung will accuse me of using horizontal reasoning, but the thing I'll say is that the one thing that seems unfathomable to, the people in the Bible isn't God's wrath. Nobody says, I don't understand the wrath. It's like, I don't understand your mercy. So when in Isaiah, when, God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways, it's in the context of God treating his enemies with grace. So that's something to consider. And oftentimes I'll hear, especially from the Reform camp as well, there's just this unfathomable aspect to God's wrath. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case in the Bible. Wrath makes pretty good sense to all of us, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned the Bible, which is good. It's often a stumbling block on all kinds of sides for this. And, in the film, Mark Driscoll does a great job of kind of giving us the different views of hell that people think are in the Bible, at least. So there's eternal conscious torment, the one that he likes, and there's annihilationism, and there's universalism, right? What with all the Bible talk what do you make of all the Bible talk in the movie, I guess?
Well, this is one of the problems is that this type of, it's probably true of every theological issue. It can't be decided on the Bible alone. And so you can always marshal a set of verses that seem to support your position, but then there's going to be a remainder, maybe a small remainder, maybe a large one, that you're somehow going to have to deal with. So, and you're also going to be dealing with, isolated verses or passages versus big theological concepts. And so you might take a concept of love, and then how do you weigh that against, certain verses in the Bible? And so you're going to have to apply reason, you're going to have to apply tradition, you're going to have to apply experience. And so the question really becomes whose theological grid is yielding the most accurate results? And then how do you even determine what most accurate results is? What's the measure? And so I think this is really where the debate happens. And I find it kind of comical how many times people will say, well, they'll approach me and say, well, if I disagree with them, it's because I haven't read the Bible. Well, if you just read the Bible, then you'll just come to agree with me. It's like, well, even within, if you want to stay within the traditional view of hell as a place of eternal torment, you have vast disagreements on all sorts of issues in terms of how do people get to hell? Is it God's choice or our choice? What is the nature of the punishment in hell? That sort of thing, like very significant disagreements, everybody reading the same Bible, because we're all applying a different interpretive grid. And so I think that that's the thing that we really need to discuss is really the interpretive grid. And then you're having, that's really, I think, where the debate is. It's not about who has respect for the Bible and who doesn't.
It's interesting. Tony Ciccarello has a comment that he wants to make, so I'm going to bring him in. But as I'm bringing Tony in, I want to ask you this, Kevin. A lot of people in mimetic theory have taught me that Jesus should be our grid, our primary grid. But somebody like Scott McKnight, who I have a lot of sympathy with, will end up saying, well, Jesus talked about hell more than anyone else in the Bible, and so you have to take it seriously, or whatever he means by seriously, right? So what do you make of Jesus, who talks about hell all the time, or frequently?
All the time. Well, I would make two comments. Number one is I've heard other people, and there's people in Hellbound who say that Jesus should be our interpretive grid, but Mark Driscoll would agree with that. But he would say that Jesus is my interpretive grid, and he's coming back with a tattoo down his thigh and a sword in his hand, and he's going to kick some ass. So that's my interpretive grid. But it's a very different Jesus. And the other side of it, I would say, is, well, does Jesus talk about hell all the time? We talked about that in the film. He doesn't really, because the concept that he's talking about is Gehenna, and the term Gehenna is very different from our view of hell. But the other thing, too, is to listen to who does Jesus talk about hell, or at least sort of punishment to. It's virtually never the general public. It's always the religious authorities who hold this belief. And what he's constantly doing is deconstructing or showing how this belief is going to come back and bite them. And so, again, this is one of the things that we wrestle with when we deal with the character of Jesus in the Gospels, is when he will appropriate a certain view, like he does in, say, Luke 16, when he talks about the rich man and Lazarus. Is he appropriating a concept at the time, or is he ratifying it in the sense of saying that, yeah, this view is the correct one? And so that's one of the debates, I think, that we tend to constantly have.
That's great. Tony,
good point.
We can't see you on the chat. If you want to hit the cam button, your image will come up. But I think that you can go ahead and... Oh, there you are.
There he is.
Hello, Tony.
Hi, how are you? What a great discussion. Thank you so much, Kevin. We just, I enjoy the terms we've used in mimetic theory as we talk about some of these texts that are a little difficult, text in travail. And I just enjoy, I like that way of putting it. And also, I think the thing that we have to add to the whole discussion is that we today are living a life in Jesus, and that we have some input. It's not just what we get from this text and what have you. But my question was, how do we overcome, though? We are in this cultural situation. We have a biography. We have a free will. Are there things, what are the things that we can do to transform ourselves? Are there actions, disciplines, or so that we can overcome these revengeful actions in ourselves? And I wondered if what you thought about that, and if there are some disciplines that you involved yourself with, Kevin.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's I think I would say, I mean, I guess the first comment would be to say that I don't think it's a matter of, I guess discipline does play a role, but I think the first thing is just really even being aware. This is what I find so helpful about mimetic theory is to, first of all, become aware of our susceptibility to imitate the violence in the other, or to imitate the aggression in the other. And so just to become conscious, and I think then it becomes what the discipline is, I guess, is in the heat of the moment choosing not to imitate. And I think this goes back to the teachings of Jesus, say, in the Sermon on the Mount. That's what he seems to be systematically trying to show us how to do, is not just refrain from imitating the enemy, but to present a new model to the one who's showing aggression against you, so that you are not just trying to avoid certain behaviors, but you're actively stepping into a different way of relating. And but at the same time, I mean, awareness. Anyone who is a smoker is pretty aware of the detrimental aspects of smoking, that you continue to do it. So we can be aware of our propensity for these behaviors, but it's still hard to stop. And I think that, this is where it just comes back to looking at what's wrong with us, like what kind of wounds are active in our hearts. I mean, going back to our biographies, and what sort of help can we seek to, help liberate us from these types of things? Because, bad choices they're always a result of, disordered affection somehow. And so how can we find healing from those things?
Mm-hmm. Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. That's good.
Thank you, Tony.
Yes.
Tim brings up another personality in Hellbound. I think his name is Chad. Is Chad the guy who was a youth pastor, I think, and then started blogging and got fired because he was questioning traditional atonement of hell? Is that?
Yeah, he was an associate pastor, he, as he says in the film, he'd been kind of pushing the buttons on same-sex marriage and that sort of thing as well. And then when he had written a blog about what he lost when he lost his view of hell, that was really the final straw for his congregation, I think. And Chad Holtz is his name.
Mm-hmm. And there's more to his story, right?
Yeah, well, Chad, when we interviewed Chad, we knew there was something going on in terms of his family situation, and we later subsequently found out that he entered residential treatment for sex addiction after our interview. And he came out of that experience with a statement where he basically recanted, he was a Universalist when we interviewed him, and he basically recanted his views in Universalism, said he'd been arrogant and all this kind of stuff, and really stated that he was returning to a view of hell as a place of eternal torment. And for us, that came right basically when we were at picture lock on the film, and so it presented us with a challenge. What should we do? Should we pull Chad from the film, or and try and find somebody who had gone through a similar situation? We actually considered and approached a guy named Jackson Bear, who was a youth pastor from the West Coast who had gone through a similar situation. But after reflecting on it, we ultimately decided to keep Chad in the film because, on one sense, it seemed like his about face had been so abrupt that I personally was very suspicious of it. And so I kind of thought, what happens if we go to all this work to take him out of the film and to put someone else in, only to have him change his views yet again a few months later? And the other side of it is I just felt my experience of Chad and, the arguments he presented in favor of universalism were so much a part of his biography that I just really had a hard time believing that this statement that he had written really represented what he actually believed. And I think that he wrote it for other reasons. That's my personal view. I've never confirmed that with Chad.
Yeah.
Can I bring in something, Kathy? Kevin, when you were responding to Tony's question about how do we not return in kind, violence in kind, but offer some new model, the question in the chat room from Kathy was about maybe film is a very good medium for showing that sort of alternative Sermon on the Mount kind of behavior. What do you think about film as a medium for sharing that? And do you know of any projects, films that are already in existence?
Well, I would say that virtually any great story imbues this concept. I teach on screenwriting quite frequently, and there's always really the battle that's going on in a film between the protagonist and the antagonist is a battle of escalating imitation. And there's a point in any story which we call the ordeal, which is the lowest possible moment in the film for the protagonist, and they really deserve death in that moment because they've just been so stubbornly refusing to accept the change that's being asked of them. But they survive. They survive the ordeal, and it's almost always through an act of grace. And I like to say grace accepted in the ordeal, grace extended in the climax. And so what tends to happen often is that in the climax of a film, when the protagonist confronts the antagonist, there's an offer that's given to the antagonist that will try and save the villain from him or herself. And so I think that there's a sense where the protagonist has learned the lesson, and oftentimes that offer of salvation to the villain is refused. Sometimes it's accepted. One of the classic places where it's accepted, of course, is Darth Vader. Is saved by his own son. So I think that there's an intuitive sense within fiction and within cinema of this type of thing, that ultimately the only thing that can save us is to break from imitating our enemy.
Yeah, it's the novelistic conversion.
Right, and it doesn't just save us. It saves the enemy from themselves and saves the world, depending on what kind of a story we're looking at.
Yeah. Kathy's still interested in a documentary project, though, Kevin.
I don't know if you've seen it, Kevin, but the movie that comes to mind for me is called As We Forgive. And it's
I haven't
by
seen it.
I forget who it's by, but it's about the reconciliation forgiveness process that's happening in Rwanda with the Hutus and the Tutsis. And I've only seen the trailer, but it's so powerful the way that you bring these people who have committed tremendous acts of horror, with people who have killed their family members, and you begin to see pain that both of them are experiencing as the one comes to acceptance and repentance of what they have done, and the other gradually comes to the point of being able to forgive. So I think that's a great documentary, that kind of challenging documentary that goes through this process.
Yeah, well, it becomes a model for us. That's something I really appreciate about Walter Wink is if you read his book, Engaging the Powers, he talks about the path of nonviolence and just how it just seems so feeble when you compare it to, a military solution or something like that. But he goes and shows countless examples where people, because they couldn't resort to violence, because you're always fumbling for the gun when you should be pursuing a more creative solution, he shows how they arrived at these incredibly innovative solutions where people refused to imitate the violence of their enemies, and it just led to this revolution in terms of their situation. But yeah, I mean, something I've been toying with as well is and actively pursuing actually is a documentary I'm calling Necessary Evil, necessary in parentheses, that really tries to in a more overt fashion try and bring out the power of mimetic theory as a way of really examining the many conflicts that we find ourselves in, and trying to show why we keep ending up in these cul-de-sacs and what can ultimately lead us out of them.
Yeah,
I think that's, really, yeah. I think that's what scapegoating always is, right? Scapegoating is always a necessary evil. That's what we think it is. Our evil is always necessary. And even Rwanda, you know why the genocide always happens? Genocide is always a preemptive strike. And so, it's horrible what we're doing, but if we didn't do it, imagine what they would do to us. And so the NSA, right, they're using that logic all the time, right? If we didn't spy on everybody in the whole freaking world, imagine what would happen. So yes, what we're doing isn't good, but what would happen if we didn't do it is way worse. And so that just seems to be this logic.
Yeah, the other argument is, well, everybody else is doing it, so we can spy on everybody because they're spying on us. Man, the suspicion that's going around amongst political leaders these days.
Wow.
Maybe it's always been there and now it's just coming out. I don't know, but it's very dangerous. We've got 1 minute left, Kevin, which gives me perfect amount of time to bring up another gigantic topic when it comes to hell. One of the things that I really like about Brad Jersak in the documentary is that he kind of tackles this myth that Christian tradition has only taught one view of hell, which is eternal conscious torment. And so the idea from that is that all of this universalism is a modern notion of what Mark Driscoll will say is a bunch of wusses who don't want to take hell seriously. But Brad Jersak brings something else into the conversation, specifically Gregory of Nyssa. And I was wondering if that part of the conversation had any relevance for you in this discussion.
Well, it brings up a few things really quickly. As number one, we should never negate an idea just because it's new, or accept an idea just because it's old, or vice versa, right? I mean, just because something's old doesn't mean it's right. And just because a majority believes something doesn't mean it's right. And just because a minority accepts something, it's not automatically wrong. I would say there's some good reasons why eternal conscious torment became the mainstream view. One of the primary ones is the alignment of church and state, beginning around the time of Constantine, because universalism doesn't help a tyrant very well. Eternal conscious torment is very useful to a tyrant. And so I think it's only natural that it would become the majority view because it's the most pragmatic in terms of the situation that you're dealing with. So, I think that, we don't decide scientific questions based on what the majority of scientists believe. We decide them based on the evidence and the arguments. And so I think that we should pursue theological questions the same way. And so that we need to free ourselves to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And, I think that that's the best way to approach life in general. Because, the universe is what it is, no matter what we believe about it.
Right.
So I think that we just need to try and, maintain a healthy naivety about everything.
certain healthy agnosticism is always good.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Tim has caught up on Necessary Evil. I'm wondering, you said you are actively pursuing Necessary Evil as a documentary?
Actively pursuing funding at this point. So
Okay.
I want to make the film in collaboration with Michael Harden, actually. But yeah, we're seeking funding and in the development phase in terms of structuring the whole thing and everything like that.
Nice, awesome. Well, it sounds amazing.
Great.
So yeah, that's great.
I'll buy a DVD.
Yeah. There you go. I'm sure
Maybe
that's very helpful, Suzanne. Nice, thanks. Tim says you and Michael would make a great team, an awesome team. And you do. I mean, Michael plays a very important role in Hellbound. I mean, you end with Michael's words. Mm-hmm. Why was Michael so important to this film?
Well, again, because I think that he holds down the fort in terms of mimetic theory and bringing things around. There's an interesting sort of balance there where Mark Driscoll says at the beginning of the film that people who are asking questions are just like Satan in the garden. And we come around full circle with Michael saying that really the ones who are trying to decide between what's good and what's evil put us right back in the garden, where what we really want is to be like God. In a sense, we start to imitate Satan. So I think that's kind of funny. But yeah, Michael, he never lets other people forget that he's the one that gets to close the film. And I think
bringing it up too, because his words are just so beautiful at the end.
Yeah.
I love it.
Very powerful.
And also juxtaposed with the image of these people sending out boats into the river. What that's in New York, right?
Yeah, that was on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. That was a lantern festival. And it's funny, it's one of those rare happy accidents where I thought, wouldn't that be a great closing image for the film? And it actually worked out. So, yeah, that doesn't happen too often.
Yeah, it's great.
I'm talking about when I first heard about it, and I thought, we knew we were going to New York. I thought, wow, that'd be cool. And, so the footage actually ended up serving the purpose. So.
Yeah. And I think Michael there quotes 1 John saying, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. And as these boats with the lights are going off, it's awesome. It's a great imagery.
Wow.
Kevin, we're a couple minutes over. I just want to thank you for being with us, and it's been a pleasure. Love the conversation.
Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Kevin, before we let you go, could you tell people where they can find your work and your DVD and support you in your further work?
Yeah, just go to hellboundthemovie.com. You can check out trailer for the film and all kinds of stuff in the film. I was blogging there. I'm now kind of blogging more on my Pathos blog, which is also called Hellbound. But yeah, if you want to get the DVD or there's other ways to access the film as well, you can find out at hellboundthemovie.com.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you, Kevin. This was
right.
Great. Awesome.
Thanks to everyone on.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care. See you next week when we talk with Mark Onspach about his book, the introduction to René Girard's book, Anorexia and Mimetic Desire. So we will see you then. And Kevin, you're awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Bye-bye.